Director. Have you all introduced yourselves one to another?
Yes.
Good deal. So then
Just did some introductions.
Good deal.
But we haven't introduced the other commissioners.
Okay, so we'll do that and we'll get started. You guests are having a conversation this morning because you agreed to with our Racial Justice Commission members, several of our Racial Justice Commission members. And as I look across the Zoom, I see two of them. The first, Commissioner Joanne Yu, and also Commissioner Phil Thompson, who many of you also know to be the Deputy Mayor for Strategic Initiatives here in New York City. If I'm not mistaken, there are no other commissioners on this Zoom, but just so you have a full appreciation for who they are. The other commission members are Anna Bermudez, Reverend Fred Davey, Laurie Daniel Favors, Derek Hamilton, Chris Coy, Yesenia Mata, and Kay Bain, along with Vice Chair Henry Garrido. So I'm going to take a few minutes. I'm going to jump right in because we want to make sure that we make the most of this time hearing from you and having an opportunity to converse with you. So this is the sixth panel of the Transforming Foundations series. It's a series of virtual panels that are being hosted by the Racial Justice Commissioners with guest practitioners and thought leaders to talk about what's necessary to disrupt systemic racism and make racial equity a reality in areas such as health, education, housing, and environmental justice. And every panel discussion has been one where commissioners have gained ideas that will help transform the city's foundational laws to embody racial justice and fairness. And I'm certain that this panel discussion will be no different. We have the power as a commission to bring forth proposals to these charter, proposals that the public will then vote on in November 2022. Our proposals are intended to represent structural change to move the city toward our vision of racial equity, a city where the worth, talents, and contributions of all people in society are valued and recognized, a city where race is not a determinant of economic, political, social, or psychological outcomes, as it neither confers privilege nor denies opportunities. I'm going to pause there for a second and just say a little bit more about what that looks like. Very often when we think about changes to be realized because of systemic racism, we tend to center on policies and practices, programs. And that's critically important. And we are looking at policies and programs as well. But I guess the meat of our work, or the core of our work, is really centered on structural change. Looking at the charter, New York City's Constitution, and identifying those provisions with respect to power, access, opportunity, who holds power among elected officials, community board members, who decides who will be in power, who decides who appoints people to community boards, and what the representation will look like. Who has access to basic goods and services that are provided by the government, as well as who has access to doing business with the government. And then opportunity. Even when we try to control for power and access, we still see that opportunity is not equal. And so what we're seeking to do is to look at the charter, the provisions that set up power, that set up access, and that provide for opportunity, and ensure that they are equitable in design, in implementation, and then in impact. And so when we're talking with thought leaders such as yourselves, we're seeking to learn from you what you see in your everyday work with practitioners, with people on the ground who are, impacted by some systemic racism. What do you believe, yes, what can be achieved by new programs or policies or enhanced programs and policies? But more than that, what do we need to do fundamentally to look at and address the devaluing, I should say, of certain people based on race, based on ethnicity, based on race and gender, based on race and immigration. So we're here to talk with you, to hear from you what you're really thinking about these issues. It's not just that you have to come with a program, or even that you have to have the exact change, but just help us to center on what are these underlying issues. Talk to us maybe about adverse childhood experiences. We want to hear from you about these early foundations and how they set up people for success and how they actually deprive certain others of success. So the work that you give to us, the input that you provide to us, it's going to be considered by the commission, and it's going to inform how we think about the final recommendations that will be voted on by the commission at the end of this year and then put to the public next year. The panelists that we've got, I'm going to talk about you all in just a minute so that people who are listening from the outside, these meetings are recorded. They appear on YouTube and people do tune in. If not in the moment, they tune in afterwards to hear what has been said. So I want people to know who our panelists are. I want you also to know that the way that this will work is every panelist will speak for about 8 minutes. There'll be no questions until all panelists have spoken, and then we'll have a conversation, commissioners with the panelists. It's not a commissioner to commissioner conversation, but a conversation between the commissioners and the panelists. So let me introduce the panelists. The first is Sharon M. Cleary. I've known her for many years and have been impressed with her work. She's the University Dean of Early Childhood Initiatives at the City University of New York and the Executive Director of the New York Early Childhood Professional Development Institute. She leads the work of a dynamic, intelligent, and passionate team dedicated to building essential systems to ensure a highly effective early childhood workforce for the state of New York. She oversees the New York City Early Childhood Research Network, CUNY's 16 campus child care centers, and a wide range of other initiatives. Tara N. Gardner is someone that I've just met recently, but already I'm excited about the opportunity to work with her. She's the new executive director of the Daycare Council of New York. She and her team work to ensure quality child and family care services through advocacy for and technical assistance to nonprofit sponsoring boards that operate child care centers and family child care programs in New York City. She's impacted the lives of thousands of New York City children and families through her work at the Fresh Air Fund, the New York City Mission Society, and the Abyssinian Development Corporation. And Sharon Content. Oh, goodness, I met Sharon, just, I guess maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but I am hooked on to her and her work and all that she's doing to impact the lives of so many children who are challenged from the very early beginnings. She's the founder and president of Children of Promise NYC, a community-based organization in Bedford-Stuyvesant, but it's also expanded in recent days and months. But she began in Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuyvesant. It's an organization, a mission to embrace the children of incarcerated parents and empower them to break the cycle of intergenerational involvement in the criminal justice system. She founded Children of Promise New York City in 2007 after growing increasingly concerned about the lack of support offered to children who experience parental incarceration. Today, they now serve probably way more than 300 children, 350 children and families per year. It's a dynamic institution. So we're going to ask, again, each panelist to present for about 8 minutes, and then the commissioners, after all have presented, will engage in Q&A and dialogue with our panelists. We'll go in the order as I presented them to you. Sherry, then Tara, then Sharon. Sherry, please begin.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's great to see you and to be with you. And I'm just honored to have been asked to be on this panel today. And hello to everyone else. My work and the work of the City University of New York and the Early Childhood Professional Development Institute embody a focus on racial equity and social justice. And so I really welcome the opportunity to be with you all this morning. The first thing I'll say is that the City University of New York and the City of New York are inextricably linked, and they enjoy an extraordinary relationship. And I would only suggest that that relationship be even stronger in our collective need to mitigate the racial inequity and the social injustice that we see in our city every single day. I will talk about opportunity for New York City as it relates to our youngest children from birth to 5 years, their families, and the workforce that serves them. Throughout my testimony, I will call for action. The time has long passed for pontificating. If the commission is to succeed at all, as Jennifer points out, it will need to insist on tangible, action-oriented change. Just the broadest context, acknowledging the historical systemic racism and its destructive impact on the lives of New Yorkers, particularly our youngest children. I'll start by simply stating that I am strongly in favor of reparations. And as we debate the possibility and strategies to make reparations a reality, how do we move to generational stability for people of color, including our Indigenous populations? And I say generational stability because that needs to happen if we are ever to have generational wealth for all. And generational stability is a significant challenge for the early childhood workforce. While the country acknowledges the evidence that the first 5 years are the most critical time in a person's life, and that our young children must spend those first 5 years in stable, supported families with well-educated, experienced, and well-compensated early childhood educators, compensation, including comprehensive benefits, remains out of reach for most. Compensation in the early childhood field is abysmal for all but a few, and much worse for our educators of color. Active correction is required, and the recent union contract addresses only a tiny portion of the city's early childhood workforce. And recent regulatory changes in New York City have made it even more difficult for early childhood educators to earn a teacher's salary. Public funding is the answer. Parents cannot bear the burden of the cost of high quality, and the federal subsidy system and the city's efforts are inadequate to date. The workforce suffers, and so do our children. Poor compensation and benefits leads to undereducated staff, high turnover, and other poor working conditions, including anemic and unsupported leadership at the program level. Early childhood educators are known for moving mountains with little or no resources, but this is not a sustainable model, and the quality of services suffer. When the workforce suffers, our children suffer. When young children are in poorly supported programs and their development is damaged, and a lifelong impact is the result. Children who experience persistent adverse childhood experiences need educators that can mitigate these issues as early as possible. Longitudinal studies prove the lifelong benefits of high quality early childhood, but we have a long way to go to ensure that every young New Yorker has access to excellence. Many initiatives are underway to mitigate the inequity, but these efforts must be institutionalized and supported with a public agenda that focuses on children from birth to 5. For too long, we have focused public resources on 4-year-olds and then 3-year-olds, when we have conclusive research that emphasizes the criticality of the first 3 years of life. So I offer the following to address racial equity in early childhood education across New York City. From a structural perspective, because I really hear what Jennifer is suggesting here, the city must adopt a birth to 5 agenda that insists on success for every child and every family across our 5 boroughs. This agenda must be comprehensive, inclusive of every child, and must pay close attention to the distribution and use of funds and services, and must measure impact to hold us all accountable. Establish a competency-based pay scale for all early childhood educators serving young children in New York City, regardless of auspice, and fund it with public funds, create a centralized benefit pool for early educators that will at least ensure high quality health insurance and retirement plans, regardless of where people work. No educator should ever be working without benefits. We must build generational stability. Design and implement a sliding scale so that low income and middle income families, particularly those of color, can access high quality services for their children without paying more than they can afford. In New York City, too many parents that are working poor fall out of the subsidy system too easily. While the new federal administration endorses this strategy, New York City should not wait for the federal government to act and could be a model for this approach. Support the statewide CUNY Early Childhood Workforce Scholarship to enable our early childhood educators who are working 20 hours or more each week in licensed facilities to access higher ed and career advisement to advance their careers and build their abilities to meet the needs of all the children that they serve. For too long, our colleagues of color have had to fight an uphill battle to access credentials, certificates, degrees, and teacher certification. We have extraordinary evidence that shows that when these scholarships and career advisement is available, people of color excel and desperately want to advance their careers. For far too long, our workforce has taken endless hours of professional development that has not led to any financial stability or career advancement. This initiative is currently funded for one more year through a federal grant, but should be institutionalized for everyone in the city. And then support greater participation in the statewide quality rating and improvement system, which already prioritizes its service to high-need communities that are constantly marginalized. Participation in Quality Stars New York is a powerful equity initiative. Quality Stars New York puts trust in the programs that participate by supporting their own creation of quality improvement plans, but then funds those plans and provides free consultation, professional development, scholarship, and other supports so that those early childhood educators, children, and families using these programs thrive. We have evidence that the gains are significant and that those gains are sustained over time. There are many more initiatives that we can discuss. I wanted to give you just an overview, and I'm so looking forward to answering questions at the further in the morning. Thank you so much.
Very much appreciated. Tara Gardner.
Thank you, and thank you, Sherry. Thank you to the members of the Racial Justice Commission for the opportunity to join this panel. I think that what I'm going to say echoes some of what Sherry has already mentioned, and I believe that there will be a few additional items for consideration. So I'm Tara Gardner, and I'm the Executive Director of the Daycare Council of New York, the membership organization of New York City's child care providers. My career and life's work has focused on addressing racial and socioeconomic injustices in New York City, particularly as they affect low-income families. I want to thank Chair Jennifer Jones, whose work leading FPWA has done so much to strengthen community-based services and for low-income New Yorkers, including in the childcare arena, for the invitation to speak today. And acknowledge Henry Garrido, who is Executive Director of DC 37, has been a consistent and effective voice for the early childhood workforce, and Derek Hamilton, who made statistics interesting and fun during my days at New School. Today, we live with the consequences of laws and regulations, so some very, very old, which have racist origins, the effects of which led to and continue to perpetuate the inequality and segregation that currently plagues many New York City systems, including the New York City public education system, and particularly early childhood education. I hope to lift the importance of ensuring reforms to the charter that establish a right to early childhood education that meets the needs of New York City's Black, Brown, and Asian families and ensure parity for workforces, especially in city-funded nonprofits and community-based organizations. At the Daycare Council, we work from the principle that you don't deserve less because of the family that you were born into, and that all children deserve a high-quality education that meets their family's needs. Children's outcomes should not be determined by the color of their skin, their family's immigration status, zip code, or income. Speaking from the space of early foundations, as Sherry mentioned, research has shown that the first 5 years of a child's life are the most important for their physical, intellectual, and social, emotional development. And that by the time a child reaches age 5, 90% of their brain is already developed. These are the years when children are excited about learning and when the stage is set for their relationship with school and learning. Yet, a child's right to a sound, basic education as required by New York state law does not guarantee any services before the start of grade school. The right to an education must begin at the earliest years when education has the greatest potential to be a force for equality. Understanding the importance of school readiness and the role that school plays in ensuring that children from low-income families are prepared for kindergarten. New York City has made historic progress in rolling out 3K for all and pre-K for all programs for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds respectively. But these strides have to meet the needs of both the families for whom they are intended and the businesses and workforce responsible for teaching and caring for children. Low-income working parents, many of them Black, Brown, and Asian, need more than 6 hours and 20 minutes of care. Of the 6 hours and 20 minutes of care currently offered for the 10-month school year that the majority of the city's current funding supports. Parents need early childhood education and care options that cover the time they spend getting from their child's educational location to their workplace, working a full day, and then getting from their workplace back to their child's educational location to pick them up. That's more like 8 or 10 hours a day of care every day for 52 weeks a year, not just the 180 days in the traditional school calendar. The school day, school year model does not work for low income working families, many of them Black, Brown, and Asian. Too many parents struggle to piece together and afford services that meet their child care needs and allow them to work. A 2016 University of New Hampshire study reports that low-income families spend between 10 and 20% of their resources on childcare, whereas high-income families spend an average of just 6% of their income on childcare. They're spending more than double what high-income families spend on childcare, and they can least afford it. We need to move from viewing childcare as a commodity to seeing it as a public good and a basic necessity for all New York City families, especially in a space of racial and social justice. And we need to develop systems based on a principle of equity that ensures that low-income families have access to high-quality services, regardless of their work status, immigration status, or ability to pay. We at the Daycare Council of New York believe that New York City should establish a right to high-quality early childhood education and care for all children that meets the 10 hours of services that families need year-round. We also work from the principle that government must support the people and organizations that support childcare. There's a Kenyan tribe who traditionally greet each other asking, "How are the children?" When the response is the children are well, it is known that the community is strong because the children are well. The outcomes for children from New York City's low-income families and communities are not good. And so the children are not well, and how do we expect them to be? I challenge us to also ask, are the people caring for children well? How can they be, especially as we collectively try to emerge from the unimaginable conditions endured over the last 17 months? Unfortunately, with the city still struggling to reemerge from the pandemic, the early childhood education and care field is struggling. Many of the providers and workers who are among those recently celebrated as heroes are now struggling to stay solvent and keep their doors open. This is true of center-based and home-based providers, most of whom are Black, Brown, and Asian women. The city must be careful not to create or perpetuate a two-tiered subsidized early childhood education system, with programs operating in public schools being more protected from market and other conditions than programs operating in city contracted community-based organizations and home-based settings. Community-based programs face enrollment challenges due to the impact of the pandemic and are likely to experience budget shortfalls due to the currently artificially low enrollment. Data suggests a 9 to 12% drop in kindergarten enrollment in New York City for the 2021-22 school year. And although specific data is not yet available, the drop in preschool enrollment is more severe as parents opt to delay enrollment if they can, due to the uncertainty of the impact of the pandemic. The city should not exacerbate racial disparities in its own budget allocations, yet too often it does. Despite, as Sherry referenced, despite the historic 2019 salary parity agreement, teachers, directors, and other staff in community-based programs are still paid less than their similarly qualified counterparts in public school settings, especially when tenure is taken into account. When considering racial inequity, the city must remember that women of color comprise the vast majority of the CBO workforce, and as such, they are more likely to work in center-based and home-based early childhood education and care programs than in public schools. We look forward to working with the commission to explore charter language that will require the city to audit, analyze, publish, and justify salary differentials among similarly qualified workforces performing similar work with city funding, and to commit to addressing the disparities where they currently exist. It's time to respect center-based and home-based educational environments as full and equal players in the early childhood education arena. The city must commit to making safe, reliable, high quality, and affordable childcare available for all families, and to compensating those who provide those services equally, regardless of the settings in which it is delivered. I thank you for the opportunity to speak to the panel, and I look forward to collaborating with my fellow panelists, this commission, and with the city on this important work to address racial injustice in New York City. We have to be able to respond. The children are well, and so are their caregivers when asked, how are the children, as a measure of the strength of the city of New York. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tara. Let me just also recognize before we move to our third panelist that Vice Chair Henry Garrido and Commissioner Friend Davey have joined us. And I'll find my voice while our third panelist presents. Good morning, Sharon. Please.
Good morning, Jennifer. And to the Racial Justice Commission, good morning. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm honored to present with my fellow panelists, Tara and Sherry, as they have spoken on the 0 to 5 age group. Children of Promise NYC, an organization I founded some 12 years ago, services and focuses on young people 6 to 18. So they have then passed the baton to my organization and organizations that serve this population and this age group. Children of Promise NYC targets 6 to 18-year-old children that are specifically a target population of children of incarcerated parents. So I would like to present today from the voice of the young people, not only of the 300 scholars that we service in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, but also for the 300 that we are now servicing in the South Bronx. And for all the young people, this particular target population that we serve, I propose to the commission to shift our policy, focus our policy and practices, focus from managing at-risk youth to developing youth talent, and begin to see our young people for their potential to contribute to our society and our economy. I believe the funds that we spend as a city can be focused on the ideas that proactively empower young people are essential. Policymakers should target youth talent development from formal apprenticeship, internships, and connecting schools and learning with professional opportunities and leadership opportunities. By equipping young people to pursue their dreams, providing them with access to networks and opportunities to cultivate real-world, in-demand skills and opportunities that typically available to the wealthy, can help them to build necessary social capital to be successful in the workplace and to have family-sustaining careers. At CPNYC, we are centered our program on youth development because we have to prepare our young people for life outside of school. Once they leave their elementary and high school, what are the potential opportunities that are available for young people? The fact that there's a phase from school to prison pipeline is appalling. Where others may accept that narrative for the poverty and incarceration as a rite of passage for BIPOC inner city youth, we seek to disrupt this narrative and advocate for policies that create alternatives. I believe that one way that we can approach this is a more collaborative on preventive measures with agencies such as ACS, DYCD, the Department of Education, the court systems, and juvenile justice systems. Agencies coming together from preventive measures rather than after the fact that our young people have been involved in these particular agencies. When scholars come to CPNYC, our children tend to already have open cases at ACS. They already have they have situations where they're involved with the criminal justice system. And at our organization, we provide preventive measures before these situations occur. My organizations, Children of Promise NYC, and other community-based organizations in Bedford-Stuyvesant and across New York City provide enrichment programs, not only that provide and allow our young people to find their voice, to be able to advocate for themselves, for their community, for their families. These are the policies and procedures that I advocate for, and I ask the commission to propose that we look at these preventive measures that collaboratively bring agencies together, bring community-based organizations together to focus on our youth. Our young people need access to activities that engage them in conflict resolution, community events that give them firsthand experience in organizing, activism, and advocacy, again, so that they can find their voice to advocate for themselves. The city should fund programs that find support in leadership and career readiness for BIPOC youth. I would like to see the city fund youth development programs that our young people become part of the city's present and their future goals, and they have a voice in where they belong in the city's agenda. I would also like to speak about mental health access for BIPOC youth. As Children of Promise NYC, we are a licensed mental health clinic, which is really an innovative way of providing mental health services in a culturally acceptable manner. Through our after-school program and our summer day camp, we are able to provide access to mental health services for a manner that our young people are able to walk through the door in a safe space and receive the services that are not usually part of the healing process for Black and Brown young people. BIPOC communities, in comparison to the general population, have significantly less access and awareness of evidence-based mental health practices, and which absolutely serves which is as a result of structural racism. The societal impact of inequality is mind-blowing. The American Psychiatric Association estimates that removing racial disparities in access to mental health services could save the country, of course, New York City, an overwhelming of the resources that could then be shifted back into the communities, focused back into not only the young people, the families, and the communities that are impacted in dealing with not only poverty, low performing schools, and one of the most recent resources that we are trying to provide is the beautification of our communities, trying to decrease the level of garbage that so many of our families see as they walk to and from their home and to the organization within their communities. Cost savings are important, but most important is the immeasurable benefits of healing individuals and communities by addressing the sources and impact of decades of poverty, oppressions, and trauma. I see that within the communities that we serve firsthand. That's why we built a mental health clinic as a part of our services. We see it when our families come in, racism impacts our bodies, and we see it on a daily basis with our families and the young people that we serve on a macro as well as a micro level, with the interactions they have with not only seeing how racism affects them and their communities, their family members, their friends, but then on a macro level and how racism affects the policies that affects their communities. We see it in the media, through institutions in the justice system, education, as well as in financial institutions. So our families, as they come through our doors, we are able to work with them in organizations, community-based organizations like Children of Promise, and we'd like to see and propose to the commission that we expand those services and provide mental health services, not only in organizations that are mental health focused, but also in other recreational opportunities and recreational organizations, in organizations and companies and areas that are much more culturally acceptable in our communities so that families can feel comfortable in receiving the services that are needed. We know structural racism is a root cause, and another root cause is just the lack of access, and providing those access, in various opportunities and various manners in which our families are comfortable to receive those services is so important. So I applaud the commission to look at various ways that we can provide mental health services in BIPOC communities. Also, I'd like to add, we need access not only to mental health services, but in a holistic manner, so that it's a manner in which our families are able to not only serve the client, but also serve the family as a whole. How are we allowing not only the child, the client, but whereas the caregivers who have also experienced trauma in their life that has been unaddressed? And then we also want to look at that returning caregiver and re-entry for the family member that is now returning to the community, being released from prison. How are we working with re-entry, not only for the caregivers that have been minding the community while imprisoned parents are away, but how are we working towards re-entering and welcoming families, re-entering prisoners that have been released back into the community? We need to provide workforce development and support to the adults as they re-enter the community. CPNYC provides services to children and young people impacted by parental incarceration, but we also need to support caregivers who are filling that void for the incarcerated parent, as well as the parent that has now been released and returning into the community. Because of the way systems are set up, there's a lack of support for the family members that are left behind. We work with those families to navigate the bureaucracy that is created from the different agencies. And that's why I ask if the agencies can come together collaboratively to provide an agenda that works for the caregivers as well as for that family that's now missing not only the financial resources of that imprisoned parent, but also the void of not having that. And for so many of our young people, that parent that is no longer a part of their life. When a family member comes home from prison, there's a lot in how we expect in managing expectations, not only for that child, for that caregiver who's been, as I said, has been managing that family, but also for that newly released prisoner. So reality has to come together. That is, again, where mental health services come in. We facilitate those reunions. How are we allowing and providing opportunities for reentry to include mental health services. While workforce is very important, unless we include the mental health services as a part of that agenda, it will not be complete. That's the void that we need. And I, again, implore the commission to look at how we can include mental health services as a part of reentry. Almost
Sharon,
50.
I'm going to ask you to just pause for a minute.
Sure.
And
I didn't see my timer.
That's okay. It's all good. You're going to have more opportunities to just share more of what you're thinking.
Sure.
I
Thank
want
you.
to make sure, though, that we get some questions from the commission members in.
Absolutely.
And if I see that Vice Chair Garrido has his hand up, so we'll begin with Vice Chair Garrido.
Good morning, everybody. And let me just say, I want to thank the three of you for the work that you've done. You are truly doing God's work out there. On behalf of many of the people that I represent, but also on behalf of a lot of New Yorkers. But let me ask this question, because to me, the current discrepancy in funding that exists to how we treat educators in the city of New York is one of the biggest travesties that we've had. And while this administration needs to be lauded and applauded for doing something about, first in the 2019 equity deal, which wasn't quite parity, right? Let's just be clear for the fact, and has done great in terms of addressing pre-K, 3K, and mental health services. I think that part of the problem we have is that too much of it is people think, oh, it's taken care of, and the reality is not. But the challenge we have as a commission has been from the beginning is, how do we amend the charter to deal with these specific issues? And we've had discussions about these disparities in salaries, which are horrible. Some of them $10,000, $20,000. Disparities in education, access to quality education, and but specifically, we talked about procurement as a function of access to the services, but funding is the key issue: budget, procurement, and all of it. How would you? I mean, I know you have some concrete solutions. I heard about the study. We have found in the past that studies, for instance, help to shed light on a discrepancy on an inequity, but in reality don't really lead to the policy that leads to action. And as a commission, we're looking for actionable items that can lead to, if not eliminating, at least reducing that disparity. So in terms of the charter, which portion of the charter do you believe ought to be amended to address these inequities? And, in both early childhood education and mental health. Thank you.
Sometimes we're going to pose questions to you that we may, that may require further thought and consideration, and not that you may not have answers to right in the moment. And we welcome you to just follow up with us, and we'll be coming back. If you don't have an immediate thought on that, very much understood, but we'd appreciate your giving some thought. Sharon? So
I love the questions, Henry. Thank you so very much. And I'd love to just touch a bit on them. I'm going to go I'm so grateful that you pointed out that the agreement did not really equal parity. And so while it was a great step forward, to your point, most of our teachers teach 12 months, not 10 months. Most of our teachers work a longer day than a public school teacher. And with regard to parity, all public school teachers have extensive comprehensive benefits, and most teachers in the early childhood sector have very limited benefits when they have them at all. So just thank you so much for the distinction between parity and maybe what the initial effort was about, some comparability. And then I would say that without a pay scale that really ensures career advancement and pay advancement, we end up again right behind the 8 ball, almost out of the gate. And then to your question about how do we change things, I think it's really critical, although probably a little bit unpopular, to point out that precisely at the moment that labor agreement was being reached, the regulations in New York City for early childhood teachers that serve children 2 years, 9 months and up was changed, and it was diluted. And so if you want to take advantage of the labor agreement, you have to have a teacher certification, you have to meet those head teacher requirements, but the requirement in licensing was diluted to not require a teacher certification. That was destructive, and I'm going to be really straight and say it was racist. We have all these women, and we haven't even talked about gender because we're talking about race, but I will also add that we have an issue because 96% of the early childhood workforce are women. And so we have women and women of color, and they are at this gross disadvantage because if they don't earn their teacher certification, they cannot take advantage of the salary parity efforts that are currently underway, let alone the ones that we hope to establish. So I'm gonna stop there to say that I'm not smart enough to know how to change the charter, but I think that acknowledging these systemic inequities that occur even when we're trying to make progress need to be addressed. So I'll say one last thing about this. Across the state, my office is supporting the establishment of a competency-based career ladder with recommended salary structures. And those salary structures take into account the 12-month work that an early childhood educator does. And so I would contend, and we are contending in this document that we're creating, that an early childhood educator makes more than a public school teacher because they work longer hours and more months. And that shouldn't be a foreign concept to a country that is capitalist at its soul and understands the value of work. So I'll leave it there for now, but I'm so grateful for your question.
And I will chime in here that, like Sherry, I am unversed in the city charter necessarily, but some suggestions that I have are for the city to be bold, to demonstrate the commitment to equity in whatever suggestions or whatever revisions are implemented or are proposed. And to be committed to transparency. I think that part of nonprofits or community-based providers operating out of a spirit of lack is because they don't necessarily have all of the information that they need. We know that in corporations, changes in the pay gap happen when transparency happens. And so when, in the teacher parity space, there is a pay scale and we know that, but for these other lines, custodians, the cooks, the directors of the centers, equal pay for equal work is what matters. And I think, or what's important. And I think that it's important that the city show its commitment to the entire education workforce and commit to transparency. And the other thing that I would say is representation matters. So being that the workforce is primarily women and women of color, ensuring that the seats at the decision-making table are occupied by representatives that fall into those categories as well, so that there's a voice present at the table.
Thank you. Commissioner Thompson?
Well, thank you. I really have enjoyed the conversation and all three presentations. And I think Henry and I are both CUNY grads. I have 2 CUNY degrees. So we're also CUNY proud. But I wanted to, first, I think there are clearly strong moral and historical reasons to argue for the importance of early childhood education. And I personally believe that one of the reasons why women's work, quote unquote, raising children, educating, caring for sick and elderly people is so demeaned in this country is because capitalism started off saying women shouldn't get paid anything to do this work. It's the work of slaves and women to do reproductive work and early childhood work, and only men who produce widgets that get sold on the market should get paid money, and everyone else should work for free. And that's kind of how we started as a nation. And so I just want to acknowledge that all of that stuff is really important and relevant for today. I don't think we can separate the struggles to pay women, childcare workers, more from our history of slavery and women's oppression, and it's all bound up together. However, the point I want to make and get your question you is, I spent 20 years teaching at MIT. And one of the things I learned was that by the time a student gets to MIT, they are either ready or not ready. And there's not much MIT does to change them fundamentally. So they come there with critical thinking skills and knowing how to work well with others and a love for learning, or they don't. But there's not much MIT can do at that stage to inculcate those things or change them. So MIT doesn't really try. They spend all their time trying to find kids who already have that, because those things are imparted, just as you're saying, very early on in a young person's development. And to extend that further, the tech companies don't impart that either. They simply benefit from it. And I think the challenge, I think you all and we could make very strong economic arguments for investment in early childhood education, because the future economy, which is more tech, basically will consist of programmers, critical thinkers who knew programming, design machines and software and all of that, and what you might call human helpers, or teachers, doctors, others who help human beings, cultivate human beings. Those are the two kinds of work that are going to be predominant in the future. And both of those things are about investments in people, not buildings, not real estate, not machines. And we tend to think of economic development as that latter stuff, investment in buildings and subsidies for buildings and machines. But the future economy that's not what's key, it's the people. And so I think the argument that you're making is strategic for the city's economic future. It's not just because it's moral. It's not just because it's historically just to get reparations right. It's also determinative of what New York City's economic future is going to be. And teachers are not compensated for that real work that they put in to build the economy. These tech companies that freeload off of teachers' work basically, are not taxed. And so anyhow, my point is, have you all thought or really done much interaction or work with some of these tech companies or economic development folks to really make your case to them? And what kind of responses do you get? Because this is actually, I think, a needed paradigm shift.
If I can just add, that is exactly what I was proposing from a fiscal standpoint. If we just look at this from the numbers, right, from the financial perspective, we have to develop our young people. And I'm proposing that we do that in a collaborative measure with corporations and looking at IT companies. How are we preparing with internship, real life corporate or real life experiences that allow our young people throughout high school, throughout elementary school, to look towards their future through real life career opportunities. It doesn't have to start in college. It doesn't have to start when you graduate from college. It should start from a much younger age. And that's what I'm trying to propose just from a fiscal standpoint. How are we preparing young people to be the next generation of employers and employees? How are we doing that? How are we as a city looking to our young people as the next generation to be able to prepare them to be a part of the workforce, to lead the workforce, to be able to have opportunities that they decide they want to be a part of, and then can make a direction rather than just going to get a job. Really, how are they determining what job they want? How are they preparing for those jobs? So I absolutely believe in what you're saying, just from a fiscal standpoint, the charter, we must look at this from looking at young people and how we're preparing them for the workforce.
If I may just interject here, I know we have 2 more panelists with questions. I want to ask, not panelists, commissioners that have questions, who have questions. Do you all have another 10, 15 minutes for this conversation? I want to get to the other commissioners, and then I have a question that I want to pose to you too. And I'm just going to, I don't know if commissioners, you and Davey, if their questions are fiscal related. I'm just going to ask us for a minute to shift from a conversation about this fiscal policy, because we have to get to the root of it. Fiscal policy is determined based on values and beliefs. And that is what is structured. And so we know that, more money should be put towards salaries and towards, like providing more care for young people. But I want to shift to the rooting. Now, commissioners, you and Dave, if you have to speak to fiscal policy, then go ahead. But what we're really looking at is the structural underpinnings that cause us to be continually, perpetually engaged in a fiscal fight. Commissioner, you?
Good morning. Thank you for coming, panelists. So in my circles, I'm known as a child whisperer because I miss my calling as a preschool teacher. So this is so heartwarming for me. I have random children running up to me in New York City, hugging me. I don't know. I'm sure that's a good thing because they're a great judge of character, I hope. But my question to the panel is, I read a study from University of Chicago that in order for kids, before they enter school, first grade, kids need to hear X number of words, right? And that study really struck at me because I was thinking, what if you are an immigrant? What if you are low income where your parents work all the time? What if you don't have the capacity set up at home to be able to hear those words, right? I think because ultimately what I'm trying to get to is then if you don't get that right first step, then what Deputy Mayor Thompson is saying, they're sort of falling behind, and so they're not ready for MIT even if they get to MIT. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts about how do we start to think about that. And then Ms. Content, I love your work on the mental health, right? Because our organization is doing mental health ourselves, but the thing that we heard a lot, and I'd love to hear your ideas, is that a lot of BIPOC kids don't seek mental health services as students because they are on their parents' insurance plan. Mm-hmm. And so then they don't want their parents to know, I don't want to worry my immigrant parents, that's something, I'm feeling a certain way. And where this is playing out in a very dangerous situation is LGBTQ youth. Mm-hmm. And so I'd love to just pose those questions and get your thoughts. Thank you.
Sure. Well, let me just speak on the latter question, and then I'll absolutely let Tara and Sherry answer the first part of your question. For our young people, from a billing perspective, we absolutely do have to have the authorization, and it's under the insurance of the parent. So we do work with the parents, but what we try to do is How is the mental health services presented to the young person so that they are comfortable to be able to be a recipient of the services? How is it presented to the family? That's what we work towards. How are we really approaching the conversations about the need and how mental health services is going to meet that need? That is really the approach that we use so that we can welcome our families and they want the services. They ask about how can we receive mental health services rather than just, from a billing perspective of how you're going to pay that and those aspects of the services that we provide. It's really having those conversations that allow our families to understand what does mental health services mean? What does it mean to have a clinician? What does it mean when we look at the adverse childhood experiences and really work with the families from a much more conversational, safe space and understanding?
I can add to Sharon's eloquent answer, especially as it relates to the LGBTQ issues. We know that the problems that that teenage kids encounter as they discover their sexuality can be perilous for them. They are thrown out of their homes. They are abused by others. They end up homeless. They end up dead. And we know this is critical. And this question that you asked, Joanne, about families and how does a child approach this with his family, immigrant or otherwise? We built for the city of New York a series of trainings on gender and sexuality in children from birth to 5, because it doesn't come when you're a teenager, you're born that way. And we wanted to find a way to normalize gender and sexuality issues for young children, their families, and their teachers. And so I feel that, again, these are the tangible ways that we support the mental health of developing children and their developing families. So, and then to your question about language, it's not just words. So the study was helpful because it moved us into a whole different space, but it isn't just words, it's interaction, using words. And so when we have really well-educated teachers in the early childhood space, they're not just throwing words at children, they're engaging children in conversation, respectful, empowering conversations, so that when children are exposed to affirming conversations, they participate more fully. And so we challenge a teacher. My favorite example is a child builds a block building and he says, "Look, teacher, see how big my building is." The teacher's job is to say, "My goodness, you're so right. It's huge. It's gigantic." So not just words, but words with richness and context and relationship based. So I just wanted to get to those two things. The other thing that I'm dying to go back to Phil's comments about who gets to MIT. We know that if a child takes algebra and passes it in the 8th grade, they will likely go to college and they will likely be successful. This is one indicator, it's not the only one. And so we think, well, we can wait to teach algebra in 7th or 8th grade. But in reality, high quality early childhood teaches algebra to 3-year-olds. And we teach it in very, very hands-on ways, so it becomes part of the brain's constructs. In other words, I was gonna run over to my conference table to pull some blocks for you, but we have blocks that are this big, and then we have blocks that are half the size. And we say to children when they're building a block building, "Gee, you need a lot of these double wide blocks. How many half blocks do you need to make a double wide?" And that's algebra. What plus what will give you this. And so that's happening in the highest quality early childhood classrooms in New York City. When tiny, brilliant children of color are exposed to that kind of stimulating environment, when they get to MIT, they not only have math concepts, they have those language concepts that you're talking about, Joanne, and all of a sudden you've got a whole ready human being who can take what MIT can dish out or what CUNY can dish out.
Right. So let's, I have a few comments / questions that I just want to engage with the panelists and I also just want to just turn everybody's attention very quickly to a note that Commissioner Phil Thompson put in the chat about public at large misunderstanding who and what is creating value for the future economy. Excellent point. A lot of effort among people on this panel to try to educate the public about that. But I'm just going to contend that a lot of it, that people want to learn what they want to know. They want to feign ignorance on certain things. And in this society, we've had quality early childhood education at a premium price because those who can pay it know what it does for their children in terms of, their development and maturation and where it will set them. In this society, we know that your early years have everything to do with your likelihood of not just high school graduation, but competing for the most, the most competitive schools and jobs and careers in the years to come, which is why here in New York City, if you can, you rush to put your child in a $50,000 child care program, because you know that it's not just a socialization, it sets the child up for what's to come in the years out. Critical thought, cognitive development, on and on and on. My question to you all, and so I'm right there with you, Commissioner Thompson. There is work to be done there, but it has everything to do with a racist mindset and who has and who can and who cannot have access to this capitalist society in the way it's been constructed. So to that end, my questions to the panelists, I've heard you speak about early childhood education. I'm a believer, I'm right there with you. We've talked a lot about mental health as a critical foundation that must be supported. And we've talked about family and caregiver support in the earliest foundation, in the early years. Understanding that we can have all the early childhood education in the world that we desire in a perfect world, that alone is not going to move the needle in and of itself. So I'm curious to hear from you, and perhaps it's a later conversation. The birth through 5 framework has been essentially a framework that has been used in the education environment. But there's more to birth through 5 than formal education. Sharon has touched upon, and Sherry's spoken to mental health as well. What else do we need to, as a commission, be centered on when we think about the earliest foundations and the earliest years for people? And I'm actually going to go beyond birth through 5. It is a birth through, the National Association for the Education of Young Children talks about a birth through 8 framework. We've seen that a lot of efforts in this society have eroded in terms of outcomes for children after age 5 because they don't carry forward. I would just, for our own edification, and as we think about the charter, what more should we be looking at to seed the most impactful, greatest potential early years and foundation for young people? And Sharon, I ask you to join in too from the perspective of what you see 6 through 18.
I'd just like to talk just the academic support and the lack thereof, especially over the past year and a half. The learning gap that has, as a result of COVID, we haven't even seen the effects of that yet. That's in years to come. We're going to be able to acknowledge what has been the academic effects of our young people not being in school for the past year and a half and depending on remote learning. When your home doesn't have Wi-Fi, you don't have the bandwidth, you don't have the space, the supplies, and you really didn't learn for the past year and a half. Okay, this tool is not equipped to teach our young people, especially those that have different learning disabilities and have different challenges and are expected to learn through a device that which we are using this morning. So I think the academic support that is necessary for our young people, and that's during the school hours as well as outside of school time. What are we providing for our young people collaboratively as an agenda and a strategy? Not just, okay, so while we definitely are going to look at the school system and what are we going to be doing academically and required per each grade, but then what are we doing to support that, to support our families, to support our young people to be able to obtain those academic goals? They may be set from DOE, but then what happens to those that are slipping through the cracks? What happened to those who can't meet those benchmarks? And that can't happen just 8 to 3 p.m. That's also from 3 to 6 outside of school time. How are we utilizing CBOs that are providing after school services to support the academics of young people? It's not just a recreational program such as Children of Promise NYC. We're not just playing basketball and soccer after school. We are supporting our young people academically, and how we supporting community-based organizations so that they can support young people and their families.
I would add to that, Jennifer, the comprehensive approach. So yes, 0 to 8, absolutely early childhood. The second thing I would say is housing, health, incarcerated families. The impacts in New York City are so dramatic as compared to other municipalities. You know, we are just a city on steroids when it comes to these inequities. Who's incarcerated? How long are they incarcerated? Why are they incarcerated? Where are they incarcerated? And when the heck are they going to get out? And how are we going to support them when they get out? How do we maximize the relationship for an incarcerated family? And I use the word incarcerated family is because if my father is incarcerated, I am incarcerated.
Absolutely.
And how do we understand the damage of that? How do we understand the long-term effects of that? The fear that even when your dad or your mom come home, that could happen again, that it might happen again. And in New York City, it likely will happen again. And so incarceration is a huge issue, but coming back to housing, health, and just fiscal financial stability. Who has a savings account? Who has money in a checking account? Who has a checking account? You know, all those issues are parts of what makes a healthy child.
This is helpful. One more question for you that I have. I'm going to keep you a little bit longer. I don't know if anybody has another question, but you all talked about the right, establishing a right to early childhood education. And if I'm remembering correctly, you know, we talked about universal pre-K, universal 3K, but you know, maybe that even goes earlier than that, with basic support, critical supports for infants and toddlers and their families, appreciating the cognitive development framework that has been well documented, researched, and documented. That we don't just get to age 3 and now start learning how to learn. When I hear that, I'm like, yes. Then I think about what has happened here in New York with the right to shelter and the growing homeless number. And I think about the arguments that have been put forward. And let me just interject, I'm also here, right to early childhood education, regardless of race, regardless of income status, regardless of immigration status. What I can't help but think about is that, there's been a lot of criticism with respect to the right to shelter and the challenge. People come to New York because they know they have a right to shelter here. And that's part of our problem. I'm not speaking of it. I've worked in government in many cases that we don't see the evidence of such. Where do you go with that? You establish the right to early childhood education for every child in New York City, birth through 5.
You know, Jennifer, I believe in a right to education, to early childhood education, but I also believe in a sliding scale. I am struggling to this day that in New York City, we subsidize wealthy families to have free pre-K when we could have used that money to have a birth to 5 initiative for everybody. So if
You don't struggle with that. You know what the underlying.
Totally,
You know what that was.
I totally understand that, but I resent it and I want to fix it.
Mhm.
So
Very good.
I can say I resent it, but I'm kind of over it. I want to fix it. And so in my recommendations, I suggest a sliding scale, because if I make $400,000 a year, I can pay for my $25,000 a year or $20,000 a year early childhood education. It doesn't need to be 50. It can be 20, and it would be the best in the country.
Good deal.
Sliding scale, why not? So that my neighbor, and just for the record, I do not make that much money, but just in case it came across that way, but my neighbor who might only make $35,000 a year, I don't want her to pay 1 penny. And I do want to subsidize her. As a citizen of this country and this city, I want to subsidize that. My favorite payroll deduction is the paid family leave deduction. And they could quadruple it, I wouldn't blink. The fact that we have that system, and I would urge that we look at that system as a model, so we can have a sliding scale. We also can tax ourselves if we chose. There are other municipalities that tax themselves because they believe in the greater good and public will.
Very
And
good.
for me,
I'm
sorry. No, I was just going to say, for me, that's the space of being bold in the charter space. Those bold recommendations are what is going to affect change. And also one thing, in response to Henry, your question earlier about what are the charter changes that can happen. One space is in the contracting arena, where the city would be required to honor and pay contracts when they begin. This whole procurement process is debilitating to nonprofits and CBOs. Contracts that begin on July 1 should begin to be paid on July 1, not sometime down the road where organizations are penalized for not meeting outcomes, but they can't afford to pay their staff because the resources are not flowing from the city. So that's a definite area in the charter that can be addressed to directly impact nonprofits and CBOs in a positive way.
Let me just quickly say something to you. I think Commissioner Garrido has another question for you. Just something always to note, and I share this with a lot of groups, and I'm sure commissioners do as well. We are a group of people who have led boldly in many different places in space. And that is our aim here once again. We also appreciate that these recommendations are not just recommendations that we now put into the charter. These recommendations will have to go to the New York City community to be voted upon. And so I'm just using that and as a cautionary. We can be bold and the city at large can shut it down.
Right.
And so we're going to have to strike the right balance at every turn, because we want to move the ball down the field.
Yeah.
And not have it ever reach the first down. Oh, I did that. I know very little about football, but I did that one, the first down, right? Was that good?
No.
Understood. Fair.
Commissioner Garrido, you have a question in less Are we good, Commissioners Yu and Thompson? Okay, so we'll close out with your comment question, Commissioner Rita.
Thank you. Speaking of bold ideas, so we have basically given the nonprofit sector a role that government many times ought to be playing. And for a variety of reasons, right? We are teaching our children in the New York City public school system, but also contracting out for others to teach our children. And yet we treat them differently, right? We have mental health providers getting compensated one way and treating people one way in city government. Yet we contract out with mental health providers and we treat them differently and we pay them different and we compensate them different and we train them differently, which is what the whole idea of this mission of this Racial Equity Commission is about. So here's a bold idea. What if we include those individuals as part of the city's workforce in the concept area and analyze the inequities in it? So I say this understanding the difficulties of city governments from pension to a hundred other things. But I think that as long as we keep treating the nonprofit sector who's delivering all the services for government differently, we are treating, we're creating or perpetuating an inequity that exists. We have the nonprofit fighting for poverty, and workers who work for nonprofits are living on the poverty.
Exactly.
We have workers who are in mental health treating those who are ill. They can't get mental health for themselves, right? It's so there's an irony here. So here's my suggestion. This is my question, I should say, because I don't want to testify. Recent analysis by way of a city council bill show discrepancies in salaries among city workers. And now, as a union leader, I have a responsibility to go and meet with the city and confer with the city about how do we fix that, right? And it's not going to be an easy question, but I know now that I have the data to show the difference between a woman of color getting paid differently than a counterpart, right? A white counterpart doing the work. Do you believe that there is a space for creating sort of like the nonprofit as delivery as not just an addendum or afterthought or here passing the ball, Madam Chair, passing the ball over, but a way of creating some space where that workforce becomes part of the city's workforce with the same requirements as a concept, or is that a bridge too far?
I don't think it's a bridge too far. I think that the city is, summarily treating contracted workforces as city employees with the whole COVID-19 safety protocol response, where if you are a city contracted organization, you have to abide by the mandate set forth by the city. So I think that nonprofits and CBOs often feel like when the city is being heavy-handed, we're treated like we're a city workforce. But when it comes to the money and the contract, we're a ugly stepchild, or they are the ugly stepchild. So I think that the question that you pose is right on target. Like if nonprofits are doing the same exact work and held to the same exact standards, then they should be compensated equally and not forced to meet the same outcomes with a percentage of the money that city workers have to do their jobs and how they're compensated and rewarded and recognized as critical parts to the city's operation.
Absolutely, Tara, I agree. In that during the pandemic, CBOs and nonprofit organizations were frontline workers. We were there. During the quarantine, we had to remain open to provide services. So the city they depend on us for all of those critical needs that we meet, but we are not respected and fiscally compensated in that same manner. As Tara just said, we're mandated, all of our employees they have to be vaccinated, and we receive that mandate via email, but that communication doesn't come along with, okay, these are the support that we're going to provide you, these are the resources we're going to provide you to meet that standard or benchmark. So the city depends on us. We meet those needs, and we do it with the passion and commitment and the desire to not only meet the needs of the families that we serve, but the city also needs, I think, to reciprocate and provide us not only with, as I said, the respect and the fiscal response, the response as well financially to nonprofit organizations and CBOs to meet the needs that we in the inner cities, in the communities, as especially demonstrated during the pandemic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All righty, right on point. So this has been extremely helpful. You've given us a lot of food for thought and ideas that we will be working up. We likely will be coming back to you just for greater understanding as we, take these ideas that you put to us and translate them, kind of look into the charter and see if and how and where we can bring about, make some changes that reflect the conversation had here. We'll have questions. We'll be coming back. I can't thank you all enough. And
Thank you.
as the other commissioners have said, we appreciate so much all that you're doing. And
Thank you so much.
We all agree that you all are the foundation for what you do.
Thank
I am available to come and play with the kids.
We'll
I will
invite
say to
you.
Commissioner, I think my dream job, is one day to just be able to sit on the floor and play all day with the children.
As you did when you visited Children of Promise. Thank you so much.
We have video, right?
As you did. Thank you. This is wonderful.
Thank you so much.
For the opportunity.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day,
Thank
everyone.
you.
All right.
Thank you. I will settle for nap time.
All right.